Great. Well, thanks very much, Mike. Thank you for the invitation and thank you to everybody for joining. I'm sure there's tons of webinars going on at the moment, so thank you very much for joining this one. So this is not just sort of a plug of the book. This is about the responsible business movement in general. And in particular, what I'm tailoring it to is what it means for executive pay given this audience. So I'm going to start by talking about the idea of what responsible business means, but then what it means for a practitioner in reward. And so I'd like to start by setting some ideas and by taking you on a journey, at least metaphorically, because we've been locked down for, what is it, close to 10 weeks now. So I'd like to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches for 6,000 kilometers across 2 continents, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the southernmost tip of the Great Rift Valley in Kenya. Now, you might think it's strange for me to ask you to imagine this because you haven't seen it before, but in fact, many of you might have done, at least in a movie. The movie is called The Constant Gardener, which is based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. But while millions of people around the world might have seen Lake Magadi because of this movie, fewer than 1,000 people call Magadi their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling goats. Now, it used to be, before a responsible business, before the theme of this talk, that cash was king for Emmanuel. So when he sold a goat, he would receive cash. He'd then have to check the cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store the cash, but he risked getting robbed. And then when he wanted to bank it, he would have to trek for an entire day to the nearest bank. And then as a result of that, he couldn't graze his goats around the greenest pastures. He had to be within 1 day's trek of a bank. But all of that changed in 2007, thanks to what I would call a responsible business. That company, as I'm sure, is Vodafone. So what they did was launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. Now, I'll take a few seconds to explain what mobile money is, because some of us think it's mobile banking. Right, I have a Barclays bank account, and I can operate it on my mobile phone rather than trekking to a branch. But actually, mobile money is one step beyond that. Right, you don't even need a bank account to operate it. And that's important because many Kenyans didn't have access to the banking system. So they were able just to send money on their phone. And that transformed Emmanuel's life. So he no longer needs to worry about forged money or getting stolen, robbed. And he doesn't need to live close to a bank. He can just graze his goats in the greenest pastures. And also, what it means is that he's got a great accounting system, right, because he has a record of all of the transactions on his phone. But we can't form something just based on one nice story, one nice anecdote. Indeed, there was a study showing that in 7 years after the launch of M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty in Kenya. And most of those were headed up by women because it allowed them to transform from agriculture into retail and business. Okay, so that's one story of responsibility. Now, let me tell you a quite different story, which is about the same company, Vodafone. And it is in 2012, Vodafone became the first company in the telecoms industry worldwide to release a tax transparency report showing how much money they were paying in taxes. And that's really important in telecoms. Why? Because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax regimes. So I've got 2 questions to the 100 people on this webinar. Number 1 is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And the number 2 is, which of these decisions, if Vodafone had not taken them, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's CSR rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody because I'm pretty sure that most people will agree on the answer to these questions. Which decision created most value for society? It was the first, right? That innovation of launching M-Pesa lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender parity. But what would have happened if Vodafone had not launched this new idea? Nothing. There's pretty much no media backlash for not taking a great action. Instead, where do you get a backlash in the media? For doing bad things, right? So if you mistreat your workers, there's a media story. And if you don't pay taxes, there could be a massive backlash. And indeed, this is what happened for Vodafone a few years earlier. So some of you might still remember a decade ago, UK Uncut reported that Vodafone had avoided £6 billion of tax. But it was said not to be. And at the same time, just coincidentally, it was announced that George Osborne was making $6 billion of spending cuts. So you could imagine the headlines, right? You, the taxpayer, is suffering austerity because Vodafone, this giant corporation, is cheating on taxes. And that led to really bad things such as boycotts of Vodafone stores. So why I'm starting with this story before I get to the executive pay implications is to shift our thinking on what responsible business actually entails. Right, most people think about responsibility as do no harm. Right, indeed, Google, their motto was do no evil. So if that's the case, responsibility is about avoiding a scandal. So you want to make sure you pay fair taxes. You want to make sure that you don't mistreat your workers. And for the topic of today, executive pay, you might want to avoid a pay scandal such as Bob Iger getting paid a lot last year, even though many people thought he created value for shareholders and also 70,000 jobs. So that's the traditional view of responsible business, do no harm. But why I started with this story of Emmanuel Stronger is responsibility is about much more than that. It's about actively doing good. You didn't need to give up 1 hour of your time to come on this webinar to learn about responsibility being about avoiding scandals. But why I like to shift the thinking is to say it's not enough for a company to pay fair taxes and not mistreat its workers. It needs to go above and beyond and be innovative and actively create value. And so that's the idea of the pie, which I'm mentioning in the book, is that traditionally we think that the value the company creates is given by a pie. And that pie can be split between investors in the blue and stakeholders or society in the orange, which is taxpayers or workers or the environment in terms of how you're protecting it. And why there was, and there still is, a crisis of capitalism is people think that investors, including CEOs, are taking too much of the pie at the expense of everybody else. So under that view, well, responsibility involves moving to here, ensuring a fairer split of the pie. So making sure we pay higher wages, we don't pay the CEO too much, and we invest in carbon emissions. And it might involve charitable donations, for example, to movements which we see right now. And absolutely, that is really important. But what I want to say is that responsible business has to go beyond that for 2 reasons at least. First, if responsibility is only about splitting the pie more fairly, right, then businesses don't actually want to do it because in the long term, it might reduce their profits, right? And so that's why some businesses have responded to the mistrust of business by doing the minimum possible. So this might be signing the business roundtable statement to much fanfare, but not actually implementing it. But the positive publicity which they got from signing this, that was something which was a real benefit, and not everybody's scrutinizing it. So what we want is we want responsibility to be something that companies voluntarily adopt rather than doing it to the minimum possible. Because if it is something which just worsens company profitability, it's only something that we can enforce through legislation. And don't get me wrong, I do believe there's a role for legislation, but legislation can only lead to compliance not commitment, right? We can mandate a minimum wage, but that doesn't say anything about skills development, about creating psychological safety, working conditions, and so forth. Okay, so that's one limitation of viewing responsibility about pie splitting. Many companies don't want to do it. And the second reason is that the idea of pie splitting is a them and us mindset, right? We are stakeholders, the orange, they are investors, the blue, and we want to take as much of the pie for us and reduce the amount to them. And we like to portray investors as nameless, faceless capitalists, and any politician who says, well, let's take away profits and give it to everybody else, that's seen as good. But remember, investors are not them, they are us. They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds saving for their retirees, and also even hedge funds. They are invested in by pension funds and university endowments. So what we need is a way of running business that absolutely takes the orange seriously, but also takes the blue seriously and recognizes that responsibility includes a duty to investors. And so this is the idea of growing the pie, is that, well, what responsibility is about is innovating, doing things such as M-Pesa, which solve social problems. So we do want to create value for stakeholders, but we do so not by redistributing value, but through innovation, launching something like M-Pesa, and then as a byproduct, investors are better off. So even though the launch of M-Pesa was genuinely motivated by solving a social need, lack of access to finance and banking, unexpectedly, eventually, Vodafone was able to monetize it. So before I go to my implications for executive pay, so what I'm talking about is what I call pie economics. Now, you can love or you can hate that phrase, but what it's about is responsibility, is about expanding the pie. So it seeks to create profits only through creating value for society. And I'll take one final minute to talk about this definition. Before you came on this webinar, you would know the final four words, right? Responsibility is about creating value for society. But why this definition is more nuanced is it needs to create profits through creating value for society. And that's why I'm about innovation rather than just things like charitable donations. But the word only is also important. So the way in which we seek to create profits is not by splitting the pie the other way, by price gouging customers or through holding workers to the lowest pay possible, but through innovation and excellence. Now, at this point, you might think that what I've said sounds great, but it sounds too good to be true. But what I'm saying is that if companies first try to create value for society, then ultimately they will become profitable as a byproduct. Well, that's a nice idea, but where is the evidence? So the heart, there's a big section in the book which shows the evidence for why this is actually realistic and it's not a pipe dream. And it's also causation rather than correlation. It is serving society that leads to better profits rather than better profits leading to serving society. But actually, in this talk, I'm going to completely skip this. Why? Because I'd like to get to the implications for reward practitioners, which is virtually everybody here. So just sort of take my word for it that there is evidence backing up sort of the nice idea. And that's important, right? We don't want people to form strategies based on something that just sounds good. But instead, for the final 15 minutes or so, before I get to the questions, how do we actually put this into practice as a reward practitioner? Well, first is, well, how should we think about reforming pay? Because this is something which is one of the most unpopular things about capitalism. So executive pay is no longer a contract between boards and executives. It's something which has got massive popular attention. Indeed, one of the reasons why people think capitalism isn't working for the ordinary citizen is the sheer levels of reward. But what I'm arguing is that actually some of this argument against pay may be shooting against the wrong target. So in particular, when people want to argue that pay is unfair, they will look at something like the pay ratio. For example, Bob Iger, the ratio at Disney last year was over 1,000 to 1. And that just sounds really bad, right? It seems that he's being paid so much at the expense of everybody else. But the idea of at the expense, that implies a fixed pie, is that, well, he's being paid so much through exploiting everybody else. Whereas in fact, when we think about the idea that the pie can be grown, well, then we might recognize that actually his high pay was because he created long-term value for society, right? Disney had gone up by 578% over his tenure, when the S&P went up by 150. And also the company had created 70,000 jobs. Now, clearly, all of that was not just due to him, right? It's due to all the other workers as well. But even if, let's say, 0.1% was due to Iger, that's actually still consistent with the pay that he was getting. So this is why I think the actual idea of pay ratios might not be the most relevant dimension of pay to reform. Now, many investors look at this. So it is a common ESG criterion. So BlackRock, they wrote to CEOs of UK companies saying that you can't increase your pay of the executives without increasing that of workers. And this might be based on evidence. So there is a belief that high pay ratios, that signals a bad culture, and that bad culture could reduce long-term profitability. Indeed, a few years ago, there was a corporate governance inquiry, and I was summoned to the House of Commons to testify in it. The witness before me was the Trade Union Congress, who does many great things to make sure that workers get well treated. This is purely a comment I'm making on the evidence. So what they referred to was a study which found that firm productivity is negatively correlated with the pay ratio, capturing the idea that high ratios signify a really bad culture. And that's why many people will look at the ratio as being the thing to try to reform. However, it's almost always possible to find a study that supports whatever you want to support. But indeed, what we want to have is to make sure that we're looking at the most rigorous evidence, not just a study. I shouldn't be saying this as a professor, but we should be wary of the phrase, research shows that. Because research can show whatever you want it to show. If you start with a particular viewpoint, let's say I want to encourage the lockdown to end, I could find a study claiming that half the population has already been infected by coronavirus. So what they actually did was they quoted a half-finished paper. Now, the finished version was actually out and found completely the opposite result. So when this paper had to go through peer review, right, it had to go through, scrutinize its methodology, and it found that the results actually overturned, where the higher the pay ratio, the better the productivity and the performance. And so while this paper was looking at US data, there was another study which replicated this in the UK, and another study which also replicated this in Germany, which is interesting because they have quite different emphasis on shareholders versus stakeholders. But it's a robust finding that actually this is positively correlated with performance, not negatively. I see there was a hand raised, but we'll take all questions in about 10 minutes' time. So if indeed the pay ratio is not the relevant dimension to reform, what is the relevant dimension? I believe it's the link between pay and performance. We absolutely want pay to be fair, but ratios are not the best measure of fairness. Why? Because, well, the ratio depends on what the median employee is getting, and that can depend on many things, such as whether you have franchised out your restaurants. So Dunkin' Brands and Chipotle have very different pay ratios. One has 48-1. I believe the other is 814-1, because one franchises out its restaurants, so it doesn't have lower paid workers on its payroll, and the other does not. So fairness, I believe, is pay which is proportional to your contribution, and your contribution should absolutely not be in short-term targets, but long-term performance. So what this study looks at is, well, what happens if CEOs have a high stake in their firm, and then we compare those to CEOs with little stake in their firm. So very simple strategy, buy companies where the CEO has a huge equity stake in her firm. And what the study found was that companies where the CEO has a large stake beat companies where she has a little stake by 4 to 10% per year. Now, you should be skeptical about this and think, is this correlation or is this causation? Like, my idea has been when the CEO has large equity in her firm, she is going to be motivated to create long-term value to grow the pie. But you might think maybe causality is in the reverse. Maybe the CEO knows how well her firm is going to perform, right? CEOs have inside information. And when she thinks that the company is going to do well, she will say to her board, please pay me in stock. And if she thinks the company is going to do badly, she will say, pay me in cash. So why I think this study was really good is what it did is it looked at showing causation. If indeed its incentives get CEOs to take better decisions, right, then this should matter more, where there's low institutional ownership, so investors aren't monitoring the firm. There's weak external governance, so maybe there's a poison pill or a staggered board or so forth. And there's weak product market competition. So those are all cases in which the CEO is likely to slack. But what was found was that in those cases, the link between incentive pay and performance was much stronger, suggesting it was the former that causes the latter. So fair pay is pay that is linked to performance. But then you might think, well, performance, right? If you're paying in shares, how do we know that they're not caring about the short-term stock price? Which is why this set of studies is really important, which is about pay being linked to long-term performance. So it's not just sufficient to give the CEO equity, but make sure that's equity that the CEO cannot sell for many years to come. In particular, sometimes that equity can vest after the CEO's retirement. For example, Paul Polman, he's left Unilever, but still has to keep, I believe it's 500% of his final salary in shares. So here are two further studies looking at the importance of horizons. So one of them is the first one, which is one of my own studies, which shows what happens when a CEO's equity is vesting. Right, we know how equity works, as they're given a lockup period. When that lockup period expires, CEOs typically sell their shares, and because they want to make sure that they sell at a high price, they cut investment in R&D and CapEx, and they focus on meeting short-term earnings targets. But more interestingly is this paper down here, which looks at what happens when companies put in long-term pay packages. Now, the problem with just looking at what happens when companies put in long-term pay packages is that, well, these things don't happen randomly. Well, it could be that a forward-thinking board puts in a long-term pay package, and that forward-thinking board also improves performance more generally. Or maybe it's a shareholder, like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who suggests putting in this long-term pay package, and that shareholder is just an engaged shareholder and improves performance more generally. So what they do is something really clever to try to get to causality. So what you can do is you can make shareholder proposals to put in long-term pay. What they look at is proposals to put in long-term pay that fail with 49% of the vote. And they compare them to proposals that pass with 51% of the vote. So whether you're 49 or 51, that's essentially random. It's not due to a large engaged shareholder like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, because if they were there, they would increase the voting support from 49 to maybe 80, not 51. So when these pay proposals are passed, what do you think happens to profitability? The first bullet point. It drops. But it only drops in the short term. In the long term, it rebounds. And that's right, if the CEO knows she's paid according to the long-term stock price, then she doesn't worry so much about meeting short-term earnings targets. But more importantly, she's more innovative. That's why I started this talk with the importance of innovation for responsibility. The company makes more patents, they're higher quality, and they're more novel. And finally, stakeholder performance improves. So measures of the treatment of employees, the environment, customers, and society all improve, which suggests that maybe the better way to make sure that companies are fair to all stakeholders is not to cut the CEO's pay and redistribute it, but instead pay the CEO according to the long term, because if so, she will know that the only way I can improve my firm's performance in the long term is by investing in stakeholders. Okay, so there's one other thing to look at before I go to the Q&A, which is the structure of pay. And this is something where I have a view which not everybody here will agree with. And so this is the idea of simplicity versus complexity. So many reward schemes where you give CEOs shares, this is often not straight equity. We often have performance conditions. And the idea is that, well, we want performance conditions to make sure pay is linked to performance, because if not, well, the CEO will get shares for free, irrespective of her performance. So you might have something which looks like this. This is an LTIP structure where there's a lower threshold. So this is £4. And if the stock price or maybe earnings per share fall below that, you get nothing. And then if you hit that, you get your bonus, and it goes up the better the performance is. And then after £8, it maxes out. We don't want the CEO to be paid too much. But there's research shows that there's quite a lot of unintended consequences of this, is that the CEO tends to manipulate around the lower threshold. So if you're going to be missing that £4 performance condition, what happens is they tend to reduce investment, reduce R&D in order to be just above the target. And what happens when you're close to £8? Well, there's no point working harder or even taking good risks by investing in new projects. You've maxed out your pay, so you start to coast, and so it's rare that people actually exceed that. And so that's not necessarily what we want as long-term investors. As investors, we do care about the company doing even better than £8 and doing even worse than £4. We don't want to induce these short-term actions. So my final slide before the questions, one thing that I'm arguing, again, based on evidence such as that, is to de-emphasize LTIPs and instead give CEOs restricted stock. So give is sort of the wrong word. They are paying for it, right? You would reduce their cash salary for the fact that restricted stock is obviously more guaranteed than something with performance conditions. So what's nice is it's simple. But we don't need to choose what are the performance conditions. Should this be climate change or diversity or earnings per share, or should this be stock price performance? We don't need to choose the targets, which is the problem, because sometimes we don't know whether the targets are stretching enough. It's also symmetric, but we make sure that the CEO is always punished on the downside and rewarded on the upside. And finally, it doesn't encourage the short-term gaming in order to hit the lowest target. And I think what's really interesting is that this is also something that can be given to all employees. So this goes back to the idea of fairness. And in a company like Disney, which has done really well, it's not just due to Bob Iger, it's due to all of the other employees at the firm. But if the CEO is being rewarded with shares, this could be something that companies can at least consider giving to all employees so that they also feel that they have a share in the company. And so it's, if you gave the CEO a complicated LTIP, you couldn't replicate that with employees. They wouldn't know the conditions under which they'd get paid. But the nice thing about shares is because they're simple, that can be expanded throughout the organization. So the Weir Group, for example, when they started to pay their CEOs, their executives with restricted stock, they introduced this for all employees as well. Okay, so I'm going to open this up to questions now, but as Mike mentioned, I just wrote a book on this, and this is not so much as a crude plug of the book, but the reason is there's a lot of talk about executive pay, but not everything is always based on the evidence. And while there are a lot of great academic studies on this, but they're often written in a really opaque way, not for a normal readership. So what it tries to do is to take this really good research and then make it practical and accessible, and so that's what I aim to do. Thank you very much to everybody for their attention. Now let me hand back to Phil for the Q&A, and I know there are people putting their hands up as well, so let's turn over to that.
Really good, Alex. Thank you very much for that. In your book, you're fated as being a good storyteller, and I think that's right. I think you do tell good stories, and one of the stories you tell in the book is about Reckitt Benckiser. And could you, in a minute, give us the parable of Reckitt Benckiser and Bart Brecht?
Yeah, so this is actually pretty similar to what we see with Bob Iger. So Reckitt Benckiser, about 10 years ago, Bart Beck was massively shamed for earning a large amount, and that I think was about £90 million at that time, which seemed a huge amount of money and really excessive. But again, the view was that he was paid that at the expense of wider society, when in fact the company has just been extremely successful over his 10-year tenure. So it created shareholder value, it created jobs, it won awards for environmental protection and also for innovation. And also that £90 million was really a misnomer, because the actual value of the shares he was given at the start of the 10 years was something about like closer to about 5 million. And it was just because the company had performed so well that had grown exponentially. So it would have been similar to if he'd been given 5 million in cash and then just bought shares with that, it would have grown to an amount like that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. It's a very salutary lesson. And then, Phil, you had a question, something about capitalism, wasn't it?
Because you learned how to mute and unmute now. That's a brilliant skill. Well, one question. You've always taught me, Alex, that you have to define the disease before prescribing the illness. Do you want to just go into a little bit more detail about what the disease is that your prescriptions are trying to solve? I mean, is capitalism in crisis, and in what way?
Yes, and so this is why sort of responsible business is now in vogue, is the view that businesses are irresponsible, that capitalism isn't serving wider society. And so the question is, is that actually true? Is capitalism really in crisis? And I think part of it is indeed reality, and part of it is perception. So there is reality, right? CEO pay has gone up a lot, average incomes have stagnated, and there have been companies which have really got profitable out of mistreating their workers or society. So you can think of Sports Direct and BHS with the treatment of workers. There is the company Turing Pharmaceuticals, which bought drugs, increased the price by 55 times, and that's their way of making profit. So there are indeed cases where companies are irresponsible. But I think part of it is perception, in that we often like to over-extrapolate from a couple of companies and then say, well, the entire system is broken, let's have massive law changes and pay cuts and so on. And also part of it is the pie splitting mentality, the idea that we look at these high pay packages, Bart Beck or Bob Iger, and always say this must be unfair, when in fact it could be a byproduct of creating value for society. And the fact that fair pay is pay that's linked to performance. So if the company has done well, then indeed they should be well rewarded.
Okay, questions? Martin, you're looking very attentive as ever. Martin Fisher.
Oh, I didn't really have an immediate question, but okay. I mean, the only observation I would ask was your conclusion at the end that the solution is simply to move to restricted stock, which I think a number of market people had said that might be good for non-C-suite executives, but to have no performance criteria, doesn't that mean that there's even more criticism? And your whole raison d'etre about Reckitt Benckiser, for example, where there's multi-million-dollar payments, wasn't that more a failure of employee investor relations and a failure of communication to stakeholders wider than the failure of the reward mechanism itself?
Yeah, sure. I'll tackle both questions, which are important ones. So the first is, well, if I'm someone who's argued for pay for performance, then isn't the removal of performance conditions against that? I don't think necessarily, because, right, so while the number of shares doesn't depend on performance, if you were to remove performance conditions, the value of the shares to the stock. So what does an investor get? Investors get shares themselves. And so by rewarding the CEO with shares, the CEO is completely aligned with investors. So going back to like that slide I had, it's not the case that investors suddenly lose their shirt when EPS falls below 4. So why is it that we give the CEO target to hit 4 in particular? Now, another thing that can be done, right, if you think that standard shares don't provide enough sensitivity, is we can reduce the amount of cash that we're giving to executives and give them more shares instead, and that gives them sort of extra leverage. And we can do so in a way that the value of the package is the same. So in return for not having the performance conditions, which makes the equity more guaranteed, at least in terms of numbers, they should be willing to take more equity and reduce the total amount of the package, which is why, say, the Investment Association is arguing for, say, about a 50% discount. Second point is also really pertinent, which is actually, I think part of it might have been communications. It was purely a reward for a single year, like not recognizing that it was based on the value creation over the past 10 years. And so I think part of it is indeed sort of reporting how these things are given. And so one way to do that might be to actually separate out how much of the CEO's pay is flow compensation. So how much they're getting for that year of service, and how much of it is the revaluation of previously granted pay. So in fact, had Bart Beck retired at the start of that year, he would have got about, I think, 85 out of that 90 million that would still entitle to him because of the appreciation of the stock price under his prior 9-year tenure. So only 5 million of that was, quote, compensation for him working for the company in that additional year. So I think splitting up those two things is important because they're often mixed together.
Thanks. Norman Pickavants, sitting there attentively as well. Given the work that you've been doing with Tomorrow's Company and all of the reports that you've produced there, do you have any comments on Alex's session this morning?
I really enjoyed the presentation, Alex.
Thanks, Norman.
I really like the notion of expanding the pie, and I thought the whole thing was going in a great direction. You know, about thinking about social innovation and so on, and the start with the M-Pesa example and so on, and then the conversation about pay sort of felt like it lost a lot of that. You know, how are organisations thinking about innovating for the benefit of society? So, could you you know, that automatic link between a company makes a lot of money and the share price goes up and innovating for the benefits of society. Could you just give us a few more examples of where you're seeing organizations innovating for the benefits of society and that having, you know, a share price benefit?
Absolutely. So this is a very important challenge. And so we can think about innovations in different ways. So innovations in terms of products, which is what we had with M-Pesa, but also innovations or investment in employees. So what we really care about and Tomorrow's Company really cares about is to make sure fairness among stakeholders. So one of my own piece of work looks at what happens when companies treat employees well. And that's not just in terms of pay, but meaningful work and flexible working conditions and the like. And I got 28 years of data to look at the link between employee satisfaction and long-term stock performance and try to show, is it employee satisfaction that leads to better stock performance? Or is it better stock performance that means that you can spend your money on treating work as well? And what I found was significant outperformance. So these companies beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. So that's 89 to 184% compounded. But there is a twist, which is this only happens in the long term. So if you're investing in workers, you're not immediately getting a benefit. You're probably going to take a hit, right, because it costs money. So it takes about 4 to 5 years before the benefits start feeding through in terms of the long-term stock price. And so that's why I'm all about increasing the horizon of the CEO's pay, because if CEOs are being paid according to hitting quarterly earnings targets, they're not going to be investing in their employees, they're not going to be innovative. And indeed, that study that I mentioned, which looked at the 49 and 51%, is that one company's put in these long-term pay schemes, the measures of employee well-being go up significantly, and also innovation goes up significantly. So that was the link to between the first and the second part. Is the first part said responsibility is all about innovation. The second part is how do we actually try to motivate innovation? And one of the ways, clearly not the only thing, but one of the ways in which that's the evidence suggests is through giving longer term pay schemes, because that means that the CEO is just not so much worried about hitting this short-term earnings target, but can think for the future.
Okay. Question from David Cumberbatch.
Yeah, hi. It was really just in the context of current events, whether Alex had any concrete suggestions around what can be done to incentivize executives in terms of meaningful and sustainable action on diversity, utilizing reward schemes?
Okay, yeah. So diversity is very important in terms of getting diversity of thinking of the social outcomes. There have been calls to link executive pay to diversity targets. I'm a little bit nervous about that. So there's a big difference between measuring things, and I think we absolutely should be measuring things such as carbon footprint and diversity and employee well-being and so on, and then linking it to pay. Because I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience, right? There's a lot of evidence which shows, well, I think the most famous article is called "On the Folly of Rewarding A when Hoping for B." So if you pay according of everybody else, of other things, for example, you could pay a teacher according to test scores, but then he may teach to the test rather than teaching a love of learning. You can give a CEO a diversity target, and she might hit that diversity target without thinking about things like diversity of thinking. So maybe if there was an ethnic diversity target, they might put me on the board, but I might not have sort of the same diversity of thinking as somebody from a non-finance background. Or similarly, that might also occur with gender diversity and so forth. You could hit a target by putting certain people on the board without changing diversity of thinking, diversity within the organizations, or ways in which to encourage challenges such as psychological safety and the like. So I think we should absolutely measure it, and these are things that investors should engage on. But I think if you're to link it to pay, I think that's one step too far, where you can hit the metric, you can reach the peak, but sort of miss the point.
Other questions?
And I think that did Derek Steptoe have his hand up? There was a gentleman who had his hand up at some point in the about 20 minutes in. So
yeah, go on, Derek.
I didn't, Alex, but I've got a comment. In some ways, I think it's very interesting. I think you highlight a lot of the challenges with executive pay in the sense of target setting, meaningful target setting, and I think the current crisis has shown that target setting is more luck than judgment, and who can look ahead 3 years. I do wonder whether there is a mismatch, though, between the panacea of restricted stock and the time horizons of executives. Because whilst long-term holding of stock makes sense and simplifies quite considerably, where the average tenure of CEOs is only 5 years, is it really going to change their thoughts and strategy when really they're thinking of a 5-year plan, perhaps, and then with the current corporate governance guidelines having to have a prorated departure event? It seems to be that whilst it sort of makes sense, it doesn't really motivate them for the 5-year tenure that you're asking them to play for the first team and deliver change.
Yeah, again, a great challenge, and sorry, and you opened the question with the panacea of restricted stock, and I apologise if I gave the impression I think it's a panacea. So it's not something that I think will work in every company. So there are certain companies for which LTIPs and the performance conditions which were asked about are going to work. So this is not something which is one size fits all. So Martin's absolutely right. Sometimes performance conditions will be appropriate. Instead, what I'm saying is that this should be something which is at least more in the toolbox, whereas it seems certainly in the UK compared to the US, it's not something which is seen as popular. Then in terms of, is this going to work with CEOs having short horizons? I think it may well do, because you can allow the equity to have longer horizons than the CEO's tenure. So as a long-term investor, right, your horizon is longer than the current CEO. I'm sure many of you will know the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, which contrasts good leaders, where the company's good under the CEO's performance, and great leaders where you don't miss the CEO because he or she has put in some long-term things in place to guarantee the company's sustainability. So going back to Pullman, is it surprising that Unilever has responded in what I believe to be a very good way to the crisis? I don't think it's that surprising, because in part because of the long incentive scheme, which has encouraged him to embed a lot of these things for the future. Now, I'm not saying that because the CEO has long-term pay, he or she will think, oh, what should I be doing in order to increase my pay in 7 years' time? It's far less instrumental than that. I believe that a good CEO should be intrinsically motivated to create value for society. But instead, if she knows that she's being paid according to the stock price in 5 or 7 years' time, she has that comfort that what she does to help the long-term value of the firm will, in the end, be reflected in her reward. So one criticism I often get about my idea of 5 to 7 year stock is the CEO doesn't know what to do to hit the target. Like with performance conditions, I know what I can do to hit this EPS target. But that's precisely the point. Like, we don't want the CEO to be instrumentally taking decisions in order to hit short-term targets. We'd like the CEO to do what he or she thinks will be creating long-term value. And I think the removal of sort of short-term milestones, at least linked to pay, is that you can look up and think about, well, what can I do to create long-term value for the company and have a more intrinsic approach? Now, clearly, still short-term measures are useful in terms of seeing how you're doing. But as I mentioned in the diversity question, there's a difference between having these things on your radar screen in your dashboard and linking pay to it. And the latter will then lead to you trying to take actions in order to hit it. And that's indeed what the evidence I presented in the second half was suggesting does happen, unfortunately.
Bola, do you have a question? Or a comment?
Thanks, Mike. Alex, thanks very much. Very interesting presentation. I guess I was just reflecting on your observations and trying to get your sense on the mix of pay. So are you really arguing that annual incentives should be out and that the leverage should be base pay plus these long-term RSUs with a long-term horizon? Because where does an annual bonus, which obviously is quite short-term, fit within that model?
Yeah, so I'm suggesting more in terms of equity and cash, and then a lower role for annual bonuses. Where my annual bonuses still come in is that even in the very long term, certain things that you do to help society aren't reflected in the stock price. So what I've claimed, based on evidence, is many things that help society, such as improving employee satisfaction and innovating, they do show up in the long-term stock price, but it would be too naive and unrealistic to think that everything shows up in the long-term stock price. So, for example, let's say you're reducing your plastic packaging. Right, that is something where, yes, maybe in the long term you're going to improve your reputation and more customers will buy from you. We can't quantify that, and we don't know whether the benefit is outweighing the cost. And so that's where some of the societal dimensions, and we mentioned diversity earlier, I think it was David, those are things which could enter the bonus in a discretionary way, not linked to particular targets, but it could be that there's some evaluation based on those broader components. So there, the annual bonus, which is discretionary, that could be on hitting certain strategic milestones, which you might think, well, it might not even show up in the long-term stock price. But I think that the nicer thing about the long-term stock price is that it is fair. We know what the CEO is going to be paid according to. There's less discretion there, so we have more transparency. But it could be that in certain conditions, particularly if, say, a strategic change is necessary and you can't wait for 5 years to see whether it's paid off, those are things where a evaluation by a informed board would be able to inform a annual bonus.
Okay. Next question.
I have a question. Shall I jump in? Alex, thanks for this. I was just wondering. Could
you say who you are? Because we can't see you.
So this is Burak. I'm on video. I don't know if you see me now. Burak from LHH. I was just wondering. I really like how CEO pay can be actually used to incentivize the social innovation. And I was wondering, what other mechanisms do you see companies use for incentivizing social innovation other than the pay?
Oh, beyond pay, yeah, sure. So, but part of this is the treatment of employees. So, some of it will be to try to reward failure. So, this is something that actually Reckitt did at Reckitt Benckiser. So, there was an innovation. I think it was the Dettol Easy Mop, which completely flopped, and yet that person was still flourishing in the company afterwards. There's companies like Intuit and Tata, which give rewards for failures where the failures become ultimately successful, so ultimately instructive. But also this idea of having not just diversity, but diversity of thinking is interesting. So some of you might know this book, Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed, which I think is really good to encourage sort of people to speak up. And he talks about the Amazon golden silence. And so that's the idea that rather than releasing a memo before the meeting, which could lead to people discussing it, and therefore if this boss says something, you're anchored to it, they go to a meeting and then the memo is given at the start of the meeting, they read it in silence for half an hour, and then they immediately discuss that. And so those are potential ways to encourage people to speak up. So I think in terms of sort of management of employees and so on, those are other ways of doing it. There's the famous Google 20% time, where you have a day a week where you can think of what you can work on whatever projects you want to, and I think those are the things which are mattering in addition to pay.
Yeah. Got a question here from Jenny Devalier, and she said she's got to be on mute because of the builders are making a noise. But her question, nevertheless, is do you think post-COVID there'll be a radical shift in the ratio of CEO pay?
There may indeed be, and indeed, while I've said I think the horizon is more important than the ratio and the quantum, I do think in times like these where the pie is shrinking, a CEO should take a hit. So companies like Boeing and Airbus and Qantas Airways, where the CEO has been paid nothing, I think that is absolutely the direction to go into. However, in terms of the reform going forwards, I still think that it shouldn't just be looking at the quantum, but the horizon also matters. And that's what may lead to people taking actions. Let's say Airbnb needed to get rid of employees, but they chose to do so in what I think to be a humane way. So they gave 14 weeks of leave, 14 weeks of severance pay, kept health insurance for 1 year, a laptop to find a new job. And those are things which are costly in the short term, but may well have long-term benefits. And I think just given the evidence that actually longer term horizons lead to CEOs taking better care of their workers and being more innovative, I think that even if the ratio comes down, that should be something which is accompanied by an increase in the horizon, because it's the latter which does matter more.
Okay. Ben?
So I, check I'm off mute, yes. Yep. So I have a question around the pie, so the piece around stakeholders and the piece around shareholders. So on the shareholders front, I think it's been hard in the last couple of years for companies to put a restricted stock model in. They've found it hard to get themselves there, and they've always wanted to see things like underpins and other conditions in there just as a bit of a safety net for them. So would love to hear your thoughts on that, and in particular I wonder if any of them are maybe slightly more short-term performance focused, and so the expected time period on a restricted stock model would be that bit longer, that it might be longer than their horizons they're looking for a return in. And then on the stakeholder front, I think one of the challenges is what the media read into it, and so it's a very difficult thing to explain. So whilst you can do it in a very discreet environment like this, for the media that want to sell articles and want to sell papers, it's an easy target to say we're giving people free shares, there's no performance conditions, and look at how much these execs are getting. And it's just it's a risky place to go if you're worried about something like that.
Okay, two great questions. And one thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to put in the chat. So I serve on the Purposeful Company, which is a consortium to embed purpose into business. It's similar in spirit in many ways to Tomorrow's Company. We've got different focuses, but we're absolutely about, sorry about this. Absolutely about purpose rather than just profit. And we did a report on restricted shares where we talked to executives and investors as to what are potential barriers for implementation, how to address that, and so that might be of help. And I think your comment about underpins is important, because restricted stock can indeed have underpins. So underpins I see as similar in spirit to performance conditions, but somewhat different in that a performance condition is something which is supposed to be stretching, and because it's stretching, sometimes you might need to engage in things such as cutting R&D to hit the target. An underpin, in contrast, is something that you should be hitting unless there's a really bad event. And so the reason for the underpin is if indeed the company goes bad, performs badly, you want the shares to be taken away. And that's fair, because if it's going to be hit in normal conditions, then you don't sort of need to manipulate in order to hit it. So and certainly within the book, I also stress that with restricted stock, if indeed the optics are bad, that the company is belly up and you still have some shares, you may want to put underpins there, so I'm absolutely fine with that. And I think then in terms of how to communicate it to stakeholders, I do think that if indeed more pay is given in restricted stock, you're removing the performance conditions, you should reduce the value of the cash or the size of the overall package, which is why people think about the discount which needs to be applied when moving from LTIPs to restricted stock. So the Investment Association suggests 50%. It isn't one size fits all because it depends on the stringency of the performance conditions. So if they weren't stringent to begin with, then removing them doesn't really make a change. But I think that's the way of communicating is to say, yes, we've removed these performance conditions, but what we've done is we've reduced the size of the overall package. Harvard Business School have actually done a case study on the Weir Group's case, which is what Claire Chapman implemented there. And what was interesting is they got rounds of feedback with the investors. Some investors were unhappy that there wasn't enough of a discount, and then it went through more and more engagement and more refinement. But what was good was the investors were willing to engage, rather than just to say, I don't like it, I'm going to vote against, rather than just voting against after the fact. They were willing to engage beforehand so that they were able to come up with something that they were willing to vote for. So that, and also the study that the Percival company did, suggests the power of engagement with investors, just to see, well, what is it that they see to be the right discount in return for removing performance conditions.
Alex, thanks. We could go on for some time, but we said we'd finish at 1.
There is someone with his hand up, though. So Giles has got his hand up and has been waiting.
You want to do one more?
Yeah, just because Giles has raised his hand on the...
Just a quick one. Thanks so much, Alex. I've liked your work ever since the Great Place to Work study.
Thank you.
I was really interested to think about, although this works for stock-based companies, have you any ideas for other organizations that aren't equity-based organizations, how also to focus people on long-term there?
You mean private companies, for example? So there's no...
It can be private or also public-private partnerships, also obviously public sector organizations. Interesting to try to make a comparison there. I just wondered if you've been thinking at all about other ways of incentivizing the long term.
Yeah, so this is obviously tricky if you don't have a stock price. So what instead you can just look at is long-term performance measures. So there it would have to be on multiple dimensions. So you can look at long-term sales or long-term profitability or long-term measures of, say, employee satisfaction and so on. The nice thing about the stock price is that it's what is often called a sufficient statistic. So in the long term, it captures many of those dimensions. So in the absence of that aggregate summary measure, you'll need to look at those things individually. But the idea of long-term pay, that still works. It's just that you would have to look at the disaggregated measures because there's no one simple aggregated measure.
Okay, thanks for that. And thanks for squeezing the last one in. Alex, that was really good. I mean, it was exactly what we wanted. It was good conceptually, expressed very clearly. You dealt with all the questions speedily and concisely, so we thank you for that. Thanks very much for the session. If you've not got Alex's book, recommend it. It's a good read. And a commercial for us. We've got a couple more meetings following. On the 8th of July, we've got Annette Mikes from Oxford, who's talking about risk. And then we've got the wonderful Joe Perfetti on the 22nd of July, who's talking about his concept of the Agile Dashboard. Both meetings will be outstandingly good, as this one was. Thanks again, Alex. Thanks to the participants, and thanks so much for the questions. Thank you, and have a good afternoon. Thanks
bye. So much for hosting, and also thank you for the questions. And if people have questions that they think of later, just drop me a note on LinkedIn. I will guarantee to reply to any question that I get. Again, really appreciate you spending the hour with me.